Welcome, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us again for another episode of Real Talk About Race. And so today I am absolutely thrilled to welcome my parents. Say hello. And I know this might sound a little crazy, but I'm really just following up on my promise to you in the first episode, which was to not do the standard thing. I love historians and anti-racism scholars. I consider myself a part of that community of workplace anti-racism thought leaders, D&I consultants, wonderful, wonderful, important work. But that's not what I wanted this to be. What I really wanted this to be was casual, real conversation that people are having in their families, with their friends, at the break room, over drinks, after dinner. I really wanted it to have that feel. So that's what I'm being very intentional about. So you're going to hear me bring, not random people that I know through my workplace anti-racism work, but people who are a part of my circle, people who are in my community. And what better place to start than with those who birthed me. And so what we're going to talk about and focus on specifically today is giving you a real life view of what it was like to live in this country when segregation was very, very legal. Okay. For a lot of people, that's something that we know about, something that we've read in books or we've watched a documentary, but it's different when you lived through it, when that was your reality. And I think that that's also a big area of disconnect between Black people in particular, and certainly people of color more broadly to an extent, and white people. It's one thing when you've read about it in a book or you kind of know it happened, but it's a different thing when it's part of your lived experience or it's part of the lived experience of those around you. And that's what we want to give you a window into today. So with that, I want to start with channeling what some people might be thinking by throwing out the question, well, why even talk about this? I mean, these laws were changed, in the 60s. A few laws started changing before then, but mostly through the Civil Rights Act in 64, 65, et cetera. Why even talk about that? I mean, that's ancient history. So the first question that I want to pose to my parents is, what relevance do you feel this might have today, or why is it something to even bring up or relive or talk about it? So Mom, let's start with you.
Well, even though the laws were changed, a lot of the actions, the hearts of people did not change. And you had a law in, I think, 1964, Brown versus Board of Education, where schools were supposedly were legally supposed to be integrated. But clearly, by the time that I went to school, I graduated from high school in 1964. The schools had not desegregated by that time. I never attended a school with a white student, either in high school or college for that matter, but that was a different choice. So I think we need to continue to talk about it because race is an issue that permeates almost every aspect of our society. And it's an issue that we have not dealt with because it's very uncomfortable to talk about. There are people who feel very strongly, as you said, Dana, why are we continuing to talk about it? It's something that happened in the past. But because we have not dealt with it, because we have not talked about it, it continues to affect policies in the present. It continues to affect how people see each other. It continues, especially with in recent years. And I don't know how political you want to get, but clearly with the resurgence of a lot of the far right groups and the groups that have historically intimidated Black people, race has really come to the forefront within the last couple of years. So it's something that we've got to deal with.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful example when people try to say, "Oh, this is so long ago. Oh, it's in the past." January 6th was right around the corner.
Exactly.
And I like to say that's when white supremacy turned on white America.
Right.
And I think the least surprised demographic on January 6th was Black people.
Yeah.
Because in many ways, this was the white supremacy that we had known, whether we knew it personally through our family, through the stories. And so it's not something that just poof went away as soon as an executive order was signed or as soon as a Supreme Court ruling was made. And so from an educational perspective, let me just run down some of those dates just so that we have that as context so that the people understand. So legalized Jim Crow started technically in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. So that's when they decided that it was completely legal to separate Black people and white people. And again, the underlying rationale was that white people were pure and they shouldn't be tainted with Black people. And so legally, the decision was made to form that separation in virtually every walk of life. Unfortunately, we really didn't see any progress in that area until I think the first time was 48. Truman signed an executive order that desegregated the military. Then we had Brown versus Board of Education, desegregation of education in 54. Then we had 64, which was the major Civil Rights Act, which started to abolish those Jim Crow laws. Then we had 65, the Voting Rights Act. 67, it became legal to intermarry. The miscegenation laws were struck down. 68, housing desegregation. And then, of course, Martin Luther King was killed in 68, tragically as well. So that's kind of the chronology. So with that, what I want to do is just go back to the beginning and just let them get to know you. Just let them get to know kind of how you grew up, what your household was look like. So Mom, I'm going to start with you again, and then Dad, we can go to you. But just give them a little bit of a feel of, what your household was like, how many people, where did you live, how things were racially. Was it segregated, not segregated? You're a little bit unique in that I think you guys lived on 50 acres of land. So your neighbors were, I think, goats and pigs, but I'll let you share just a few minutes of that.
I grew up in a very small town in South Carolina, so I knew Jim Crow very, very well. I had 5 sisters, and I grew up in a family that was pretty atypical in some ways because both my parents were educated. Most African American families their parents were not educated, but both my parents were educated. In fact, my grandparents were educated.
Which was really rare.
Yeah, right? Which was very rare. So my father held a very high position in the community, both my parents. My father was a minister, and ministers were revered in the Black community. They were the leaders. And he was the principal of the school. So he was a very respected, and he and my mother both were very respected community members. But I grew up always understanding that I needed to learn my place in society. I had no white friends. In fact, I never interacted with white children. And if I did, I had learned that I had to be very differential. The big thing about growing up in the South was that as a Black child, you learned that the one thing you wanted to avoid was any kind of power encounter with a white person. Because if you ever put yourself in a position where power was involved, you would lose. The one thing I remember, I think, most from growing up, my parents didn't talk a lot about race, but you saw evidence of how they viewed race. My father, despite the fact that he was very authoritarian and respected and whatever, his whole personality would change in the presence of a white police officer. If he were pulled over and given a speeding ticket or whatever, he became very docile, very childlike. He was very, sometimes the police officer would call him boy or Isaac, and nobody called my father Isaac except his mother. and he accepted it.
Even grandma didn't colonize it.
Excuse me?
Even grandma didn't colonize
Even my
it.
mother didn't, because it was such a, she called him Reverend Butler, even though, you know, they were married for 65 years. And it wasn't an issue of superior subordinate. It was an issue of respect. I think that Black men in particular really had to find ways of 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 being respected. And so a lot of Black men, I know, like people in the church, they would they would be called deacon this and deacon that. You would see them in the store, and you would never call them anything but deacon. They really revered whatever titles they could get, and they would want to hold on to those titles because everything else in society told you that you were less than. Um, I went to an all-Black school. I, you know, uh, I had limited social experiences as growing up because everything was segregated.
Right. And you know, and there was some benefit to that. It wasn't that I mean, obviously it's horrible, you know, the rationale behind it, but when I think about your childhood through your eyes, part of what I'm hearing you say too is, you know, we lived in a Black world. We lived in a Black world. We didn't interact with white people. But I'm just wondering, did you ever wonder why there were no white people?
I wondered. I knew that I was supposed to feel that I was less than, and
You
part
knew
of
that
that
you were
was women.
supposed to feel you were
Yeah,
less
yeah.
than.
I knew that I had to play that role. Um, and, but I'm not sure I ever felt that. I always knew that I was smart, you know, and that's where the Black experience probably helped me. My Black teachers would say, you know, you're really smart. You're smart. But even though they said that, I always wondered, am I smart as they are? Because
Right.
there was never any way for me to measure whether or not I was as smart in the Black world, but was I truly smart in the white world? You know, could I compete with white kids? And the
Right.
irony was that the closest school to me was a white school. So I would see the white kids, but I could not go to the white school. Um,
And you know, one thing I was going to say, when you talk about how grandpa's demeanor would change around white people, I never have told you this, but I remember when I was about 11 or 12, maybe 10, 11, something like that. And all the cousins, we were in South Carolina. And I literally remember, I don't even know why I remember this. I remember running into the kitchen and grandpa was sitting there and we were telling him a story about something that had happened, me and Tiffany and Crystal. And I just remember that as soon as we started telling him, he turned around and he said,
I can tell you what he said.
"What?
I can tell you what he said.
You know what he said?
Uh-huh.
What did he
Okay.
say?"
Was he colored or white?
Exactly. That's exactly
Wow.
what he said. He said, was he white or colored? Was he white or
Right.
colored?
Right.
And then I just remember thinking, well, what difference does it make whether he's, you
It,
know,
it
white
made
or colored?
it made
But
all
what's
the difference in
funny
the world.
is now when I'm talking to Austin, he'll tell me about something that happened to him when he's away from me. And one of the first questions I'll ask is, were they Black or were they white?
Yeah,
And that's a whole different program. And I'm sure people can take that and pick it apart and make assumptions. And in some ways, I'm probably just asking because I'm trying to figure out who the kid is. There's so many kids in the class or so many different teachers. Maybe I'm trying to just figure that out. But it's so interesting that it's like almost in a second, it's like he had to kind of in his mind figure out, well, what situation am I dealing with?
Exactly. And I think you've put your finger on the issue. Everything was filtered through the prism of race. You know, when I got ready to go to college, even though I was valedictorian of my class, and I wanted to go to the University of South Carolina, that was not an option for me. You knew that you had to stay in your lane. So I can tell you, my first real experience with the white world was to leave an all black school and go to Yale University. Now that was
Well, you know what? Okay, I want you to put a pin in that. I want to go to Daddy because he's got a very, very different childhood, different experience. But I'm going to come back to you because I want to hear what was that Yale experience like? And also, what did you learn now finally being around white people? Um, because I'm sure that was an interesting experience. And I can share some things about my experience as well, because I obviously had a very integrated experience. So, Dad, for you, now, my mom grew up in South Carolina. So she was in the deep South, Jim Crow, everything, separate water fountains, separate this, separate that. What I would like you to talk about was where you grew up, how it was different. And then I'd also like you to share the difference that you noticed when you would go down south.
Okay. While I'm 5 years older than my wife, and I was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, deep south, my experience was altogether different because I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My parents, at that time, when my mother birthed me, she was only 17 years old. Mm-hmm. So she was very close to my age. But we moved to Brooklyn, New York, and I know nothing of growing up in North Carolina. Although each summer, my mother would send me back to North Carolina to live with my cousins for the summer. And that was the only experience I had about Jim Crow. I remember an experience where we went into a restaurant and I went up to the counter to order my lunch or whatever we were getting. And one of my cousins grabbed me by the neck and pulled me back. I didn't understand what he was doing. But later I understood that it was a segregated establishment, and coloreds, as we were called at that time, were not allowed to go up to the counter. And we had to go to a different section to get our food to go. We couldn't sit down there and eat it.
But, now, about how old were you?
Oh, well, I started going there from the time I was like 7 or 8 until I was grown, 18 for 10 or 15 years. So I did it every summer. But at that time, I was about 10. Okay. Now I'm 10 years old. My experience, as I said, was very different from my wife's experience. And in Brooklyn, New York, I grew up with the white kids, and all the time we did various things together. And I was so oblivious to what was going on, although I did read the newspapers and see the news accounts of the segregation and the things that happened in the 50s and the 60s.
And that's just a great example that it didn't have to be that way.
No,
it didn't have to be that way. It's like, you had a completely different experience.
Different experience. So let me tell you about my educational background real quickly. As I said, I grew up in Brooklyn, and I don't even remember the first, second, and third grade years of going to public schools. There was a public school around the corner. And my parents and my brother and I all lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, 1 flight up. I didn't know anything about living in a house. So we were poor, but we were rich in love. And my brother and I were very protected. We didn't go anywhere without our parents. So
a lot of play.
You're right, very near home. And I went to a public school for the first 3 years. I don't even remember it. But in the 4th grade, my parents sent me to Bethel Elementary School, a parochial school, Seventh-day Adventist, and that changed my life. Because at that time, I met a teacher named George Washington Timpson. By the way, this school was all black school. And George Washington Timpson instilled in me a sense of I could do well in school. And I did do well. I graduated second in my class as a salutatorian. And I got a lot of self-confidence as far as education was concerned. And as I got older, another part of me that made a big difference in my life was my athletic prowess. I could run and jump and do all kinds of things a lot better than the other kids that I played with in the neighborhood.
Right.
So I grew, and the confidence in oneself was very important to me, and I learned the importance of education at that time. And George Washington Timpson taught me that I needed to always strive to do the best that I could, and I did well.
So it sounds like you had more integration. There were white people around, but you still lived in a pretty segregated sort of community. Like the school was Black, and I guess the friend, although you said you had white friends, right?
I did well. It's different worlds. I lived in Brooklyn on a street that was predominantly Black.
Right.
And I didn't leave there unless we were going someplace.
Okay, right.
But one thing Ted didn't tell you, he may not have experienced the Black South, but his parents did.
Oh, gosh.
And his parents escaped the South. And his father told stories about a cousin of his being lynched for looking at a white woman. And suddenly they were coming for other people in the family. And that was one of the reasons that the family had left that town in North Carolina and moved to New York,
Right.
where Ted and his family. So even though he may not have experienced it, his parents would not have been in New York had they not had that experience in North Carolina.
And thanks for bringing that up. If you haven't read The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, it's an amazing, gripping account of the Great Migration. So many Black families fled the South, just desperate for a better life. I'm also glad that you mentioned lynching, because so much is misunderstood about that. It's seen as a rarity, but what people fail to understand, as horrible and horrific as slavery was, literally we went from 1619 to 1865-ish, when there was Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. And then after that, arguably, it got worse for so many Black people, because that's when lynching became so much more prevalent. The most dangerous year for Black people in terms of lynching was 1892. More Black people were lynched in 1892 than any other year. That was 30 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Because guess what? For white people who owned slaves, for most of them, the slaves were their most valuable asset.
Right.
So even though they might have whipped them, beat them, raped them, treated them horribly, they needed them to work.
Yes, the farms.
And so you progress from a slave being an asset, because you didn't want to kill it, because that'd be like burning down your own house. I mean, that's your most valuable asset. But then when we moved into convict leasing, and if you're not as aware of this period after slavery, please read Slavery by Another Name. It is an amazing, amazing account. He talks about how things became so much more dangerous for so many Black people, because then we went into this era where they started something called the Black Codes, and essentially you could get arrested as a Black person for looking at a white woman, or for yelling too loud, or vagrancy, or not being able to prove that you're employed, all these random ostensible crimes. And they would become literally slaves by another name through the convict leasing program. And that's really where there was so much lynching, because if a mining company or even a plantation owner leased a slave and killed them, well, they would just go get another one.
Right.
Like when you rent a car, how do you treat that car versus the car that you own? They would just turn them in and go get another one. So when we talk about, grandpa saying, was he colored or white, or when we talk about our grandparents, people who lived during those eras, the crime, the criminal violent activity that they saw, we just can't even imagine it.
Right. And also the fear that they always lived in. My father had 3 full-time jobs. He was a full-time principal, he was a full-time pastor of a church, and he was a full-time farmer. And growing up, I wondered why he had 3 jobs. And I finally realized later on that he had 3 jobs because he never knew when his professional career as a principal would be ended, because his supervisor was a white person. Mm-hmm. And all Black people lived in fear of just being told that they could not come back to work. when my oldest sister went to college and she started participating in sit-in marches at Fisk University with John Lewis, my my father's supervisor, she appeared on the cover of Jet magazine, and where there was a story about her participation in civil rights, the sit-ins, and somehow that got back into the community. And my father's supervisor, Mr. Hatchett was his name, aptly called Hatchet. He called him in and said, if you can't control your children, you need to find you another job.
Right.
So it was something that they lived in fear of all the time, that someone else controlled their lives, that they would be victimized.
Yeah, one of the sayings that I have is that I think that so many Black people have a generational PTSD
Yeah.
because there's a trauma that has been passed down generation to generation. And it makes sense. It makes complete sense that there's this deeply embedded fear of white people. And so you feel that you can't be your authentic self. You can't be as forthright as you might want to be. Certainly not everybody, but I think that it's there for many. So let's go back to you in terms of when you went to Yale. Tell us a little bit about that. And in particular, how you felt differently about yourself, if you did, having that experience, being immersed kind of in the, for lack of a better term, white world.
Yeah, there was a lot going on when I went to Yale that summer. First of all, I got there because it was during the time when the Ivy League schools decided that they wanted to bring in some Black students to their graduate programs. I graduated from college in 1968, and I went to Yale during the summer of '67 between my junior and senior year at Bennett College. Harvard, Yale, and Columbia had teamed up, and they decided that if they wanted Black students, the place to go to find them was the South. And so they went to the historically Black institutions, and I attended one of them, Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina. And I was recommended by my college to go to Yale as a good prospective student to go to graduate school at Yale. So I was selected by my college to represent my college at Yale. And so when I went there, first of all, I went on a bus. And at that time, I'm not sure if the buses was, I guess they were, yeah. But even if they weren't, I probably still sat in the back, because you get conditioned. But when I got there, I was clearly I was like a fish out of water. I was only, let's say I was maybe 18 or 19. No. I was 19 because I graduated from college at 20, right?
No.
Well, whatever. I was young.
I was young. About 15 or 16.
No. This is my junior year, not the freshman year. So I got there, and my first thing was to look for other Black students, and there were about 8 other Black students on campus that they had brought in from Black schools. So I thought, well, maybe I can connect with them. But what we found out immediately was that we were all in different areas. I was in English, and somebody else was in math, and so the chances of our being involved with each other was very minimal. We became an oddity on campus. Clearly, most of the students had never interacted with Black students. And so a lot of people, when they would come up to you, you felt that they were engaging you in conversation, not because they were interested in you, but they wanted to hear you talk. It was like you were an oddity. So lots of people wanted to talk to you, but you just could never relax. So the work itself was very intense. I was there for 6 weeks, and I think we were studying Shakespeare. One of my classes was Shakespeare, and when the professor said we will be studying Shakespeare, he literally meant all of Shakespeare. The amount of work that we covered in 6 weeks was incredible. The difference was that he expected that the students had read all of the works, and he would just be sort of reviewing it. So I came in and I recognized that my background wasn't as strong as it needed to be, as I wanted it to be. You know, I survived and I was invited back, but I remember always feeling uncomfortable at Yale. I couldn't get my hair cut. There was no black church. It was just one of the most negative experiences of my life.
Right.
In fact, I never said this to you, but um, if you had wanted to go to Yale, I would not have wanted you to go to Yale.
Right.
That experience had been so negative, not in terms of the academic portion, but in terms of everything else. They did nothing on that campus to help us adjust to our different environment. They just threw us there, and if we could survive, we survived. If we couldn't, we didn't. But it was not a good experience at all.
And I think this is an important point for some people who may ask the question, well, why do you need a Black student union? Or why do you need historically Black colleges and universities? Because when you're immersed in a dominant culture that, first of all, might be hostile towards you, not to mention is not ingratiating or is not making accommodation, is just continuing to go 100 miles per hour with whatever assumptions work for that dominant culture, and is not really being inclusive or doesn't have that inclusive mindset, that's a horrific experience. And so for many Black people who choose to go to HBCUs, big shout out to HBCUs, Stacey Abrams, Kamala Harris. HBCUs produce amazing, amazing leaders. Right now, there are no Fortune 500 CEOs that are Black females, but that will change in March when my Spelman sister takes the helm at Walgreens. So amazing in terms of the product, in terms of the work, but we wanted to attend a place where we can feel like we can show up as our authentic selves, where really race wasn't an issue. You know, I was at Spelman for 4 years, and we talked a lot about race, but we talked about it from the most positive perspective, about learning about history, about learning things that maybe we hadn't been taught in high school. But in terms of feeling any sort of discrimination or feeling like you're not included or people don't understand you, that's a non-starter. You can put that to the side because you're in an environment that really is made for you. Now, for another thing that was really instructive was being in an integrated environment in high school. Because I had been around white people pretty much my entire, life as a child, and then all the way up through high school, I knew they weren't any smarter. I mean, I knew I was one of the smartest kids in the class, every class I was in. So for me, that was really, really helpful from a confidence perspective. And I can't imagine what that does to your psyche when you grow up in an environment that doesn't just say you're not as smart, but says you're less human, like you're not fit to use the same fork as someone else or eat from the same plate or drink from the same water fountain. I mean, that's got to really be damaging to one's psyche. So with that, I want to kind of wrap up, and I really just want to get your closing thoughts in terms of, we're all trying to figure out a way forward. We're all trying to figure out how we can build a more anti-racist society, build more anti-racist workplaces. I will say, I haven't even asked my mom yet, but I'm probably going to ask my mom to come on another time because she really has had, in particular, an amazing trajectory. I want you to tell the story about not being able to attend the University of South Carolina when you were a child, but then becoming a full professor and also being superintendent of the school district. And that was just an amazing, amazing cycle. And so I know you have a lot to share in terms of being an educator. They're both educators, both doctorates in education. So I want to come back and talk about that. But I'd love to close with just your thoughts and your recommendations. What is it that we need more of in terms of moving forward? Or what is it, I try to discuss the undiscussables. What is it that you think that most Black people are afraid to say in mixed company? Or what is it that you think that white people really do need to better understand for us to be able to move forward? Anything? I know that actually wasn't one of my questions. I sent them in advance.
I think,
and maybe you can even think
about
your own experience in
Yeah.
work and your experience being like the first and the only and all of that.
I don't think I'm not going to speak for Black people, but let me talk for me. I don't expect a white person to be able to understand my experience at the level that I understand it.
That you lived
that I lived it. But I do expect them to listen and honor my experience. Don't minimize it. Don't try to gloss over it. Listen and to the extent possible, educate yourself. And I don't mean formal education, but just accept the fact that there is a sin, there is a hurt that this country inflicted on a group of people for a very, very long time. And what those people who experienced it firsthand do every day of their lives is that they look at other things that are happening through a lens because they are fearful. Like you would say that people were surprised by the 6th, what happened on January 6th. People in my generation were not only not surprised, they were scared. They were taken back to the days when racism didn't have to hide itself, when people could walk around with Confederate flags and say things and call people names, and there were no repercussions. And the fear you had was, my God, I'm 72 years old now. That's what I grew up with when I was 18. I thought we had moved so past that. And the problem is, when you see that, you know that's out there, but you think that the larger society would just have come down on that in such a way that all of that would have been stopped in its tracks. And what we see is that maybe we haven't come as far as we thought. And we're not talking about the fringes. We're talking about the people. We're talking about
the judges, the police officers, the lawyers. That's why, even though George Floyd happened on the same day as Amy Cooper, what's so interesting about that, George Floyd was the extreme. George Floyd reminded us of like back 100 years ago, the lynching, the knee on the neck. But what we got to be more afraid of is the Amy Coopers. Because the woman in Central Park, that's somebody's boss.
Exactly.
Those people that are, our neighbors and our pet groomers and teachers and lawyers and politicians, those are just the everyday people.
Right.
Normal.
Right.
When in Central Park, it's a whole different story. We just got a window into her psyche and her ability to decide to weaponize racism on a dime.
Right. Well, one of the things I'm convinced of is that the racism will persist as long as people who are racist are in positions of power, because they will make decisions that will allow them to maintain their power. And when they do that, they are structuring systems that are racist.
Certainly, yeah. And that's why the systemic, we tend to focus on the individual racism, but the systemic racism is really what does so much more damage. But the individuals are important because the individuals make the systems.
Absolutely.
So they're both critically important. And then, Dad, any closing comments?
Well, I look at what can we do to make things better for our country. And one of the things that I feel confident in is that we need more of an assimilation, Black and white people working together. And when you know a person, or you don't have, and you feel comfortable with them, then there's not the fear. When you don't have the fear, you're probably not going to get the racist attitudes, the behaviors.
Right.
So you look at the most racist place you want to find, it's the church. And it's predominantly one race or the other. But when you mingle them, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, that's why our first episode was just about that fundamental issue of the fact that most of us live pretty segregated lives on a personal level. If you look outside of the workplace, and this, not to say that's a horrible thing, people gravitate to people that they have a lot in common with and their families and etc. But that can be problematic. And so oftentimes work gives us a facade that we're much further along than we are. But too often what happens is as soon as you get outside of work, we kind of settle into what's more normal. And our normal, in a lot of cases, does tend to be pretty segregated. And so that can have some tragic consequences when you start to think about, well, what biases might I have as a result of that? What might be some of my assumptions? What policies might I be supporting? What decisions might I be making? Because I live in my bubble and I really don't have any consciousness about this other bubble or other cultures or other people. But thank you. I just want to thank you for sharing so much of your story. That's exactly what I wanted to do today. That's why we did it. You're my parents. I've heard your stories my whole life, but everybody doesn't have that. We all have our own story. And so I really just wanted to share, wanted to open this up to a broader audience. And I really encourage people, go out, get to know the people in your circle, the people in your workplace. Everybody has a story. So please.
Can I tell you one thing in terms of your father and I getting married and living in New York, and then we moved back to South Carolina with you and Todd. And one of the biggest, not arguments, but disagreements we had was what you guys would say to adults. I was brought up that you always had to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and that was part of the culture. The culture. And your father was brought up with saying that was very subservient, and you never say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. You said yes and no. So I don't know if that fits in, but
we still disagree on that.
That's right. And I even remember some teachers getting on me about not saying yes, ma'am. I'm like, well, I don't call my mom ma'am, so why am I going to call you ma'am? But we have different cultures, and that's okay. But it's about taking the step to get beyond your culture. And when you have more people in your network, you have a broader multicultural lens, you just receive information differently. You look at situations differently. You have the benefit of another perspective.
Go ahead. Dana, I was afraid that if you went to a school and didn't say yes, ma'am, or no, ma'am to a white person, there would be different repercussions. That it wasn't just a matter of yes, ma'am, or no, ma'am. It was she will be perceived as not showing the proper deference to a white person, and then what would be the repercussions for her, even if she didn't, because see, that's my psyche.
Well, you know what? I actually didn't know that. And when you also layer on the fact that we had corporal punishment growing up, like I don't even know how much people know that. Yeah. When I was growing up, teachers could spank you.
Right.
I mean, my dad was a principal. I think he had a paddle in his office. So is that true? I mean,
that's true, but I changed later in life.
Okay. But I'm just saying, times were different back then. I mean, back then teachers could spank you. And not to mention, somebody might do something they weren't supposed to do. So that's a really, really good point. I actually didn't know that. But again, it's the fear. It's that thread of fear of knowing what those repercussions could be. So with that, thank you. I appreciate it. We'll have you on again.
Okay.
Bye. Until the next time. Bye.
All right. Join us first and third Tuesdays for LinkedIn Live. We'll be on LinkedIn Live and YouTube Live. We're talking about real talk about race. Please join us.